You might think it goes against my grain to preach a sermon related to Memorial Day, or any other civic holiday for that matter. I have a couple seminary professors who would be scandalized because they insisted on separation of church and state, and that the church is for God, not for our country or for any other country for that matter. And they could cite the example of the German church in the 1930s that supported the Nazi regime. Regardless, I realize that when I preach on Mother's Day, I often include Mother's Day themes. And that's not a church holy day either. So given what's been going on as a church, the theme of Memorial Day seemed especially appropriate to draw in this morning. One of the things I read about this past week about Memorial Day in the church, that there may be folks who want to explicitly keep Memorial Day to remember fallen soldiers only, which is what tomorrow's holiday was designed for, to remember those who died in active military service. However, I also learned from my friend Sue, who's a pastor in North Carolina, I met this pastor in North Carolina, that the churches in her community all combine for Memorial Day service on that Sunday. And that's essentially what we would call an All Saints service for the community. They read out the names and remember all who have died in that community during the past year, just like we do the first Sunday in November. I thought Memorial Day, like All Saints Day, now that I can get behind, and that makes sense for us as a church. Using the theme of Memorial Day makes sense for us as a church because we as a church, I think, are grieving, and we have been for quite a while. One of the pieces of advice given at the Festival for Homiletics I was at a couple weeks ago was to make sure you could name and describe the time in which you live. And I pointed out, as a country, things are going well as a country by all the usual numbers, all the usual measurements. And yet, we as a whole are angry, and we're afraid, and we're impatient. As a church, things are going well, statistically speaking. That's why I made it a point to include that list in the last newsletter of all the good things that are going on. I started to do it as a year-end list for 2016 that I was just going to add to as the year went on. But I realized that the list was already so long, just for the first 3 or 4 months, that we needed to share it and celebrate it now. Things are going well here on many levels. And yet we are also in a season of grieving. And sometimes it seems like the grieving cancels out the good things, which is why I will remind you again and again and again of the good things. Grief can be overwhelming. Or you can think you've moved past it, but the truth is it pops up at random times, and often the least expected times. We are hurting, and if we look at this morning's texts, we find grief in all of our readings. First, from 1 Kings, we read about the contest between Elijah and the 450 prophets of Baal. Elijah challenges them to see whose God will set on fire some dry wood. Baal, of course, doesn't respond to his prophets since he's not a real God. And then Elijah seems to taunt them. He drenches his wood with water, not just once, but 3 times, completely drenching the wood with water before praying to God to ask God to set the wood on fire. The senior pastor I served with before we moved here had a lot of fun Southern sayings. He's from the hills of Tennessee, and one of my favorite ones was, "If that don't light your fire, then your wood's all wet." It's a good one, isn't it? Well, in this case, the wood is all wet. But God is God and can set anything on fire. And he burns up all the wood, the sacrifice on the altar, the stones of the altar, and says even the dust and even the water in the trench around it is all burned up. And everyone who witnesses this falls on their faces and proclaims, "The Lord is the real God." And our story ends there. Because if we were to read one more verse, we would learn that Elijah got so carried away with the victory that he had all 450 prophets of Baal captured and killed. Better to end on a high note, right? But why is Elijah by himself challenging those 450 prophets? And why does he rub in his victory over them? It's because Elijah is the only one, the only prophet of God who is left. King Ahab of Israel, who worshipped Baal, had killed all the other prophets of the Lord at this time, and Elijah is the only one left, a prophet of the Lord. All of his colleagues have been killed, and he's the only one left. And I'm sure he's grieving that loss, and that had an impact and an effect on him. All of his colleagues gone, he's the only one left. And so he acquits himself fantastically with this challenge with Baal's prophets. And then he goes a step further and seeks revenge for the death of his friends by having those other prophets killed too. The things we do in the midst of grief. We don't always make the best choices. And after this is when Elijah runs away and he goes to God's holy mountain and he prays and he listens and he hears God's still small voice, which is a story we'll read in a couple weeks. Grief can make you fearless. It can make you take on 450 people at once. And it can also sometimes make you overzealous when you don't just defeat those 450, but insist on killing them as well. Our epistle lesson from Galatians also has a lesson on grief in it. No one dies this time. Yet if you listen again to what Paul writes, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ to follow another gospel. It's not really another gospel, but certain people are confusing you and they want to change the gospel of Christ. Paul is writing to the churches in Galatia, plural, because Galatia is a region, it's not just a town. And these are churches, this is a region, these are churches that were Paul personally started, and a region he traveled all over evangelizing. You can read about it in Acts chapters 13 and 14. Paul personally has something at stake in these churches. And so it's understandable that he's upset that folks are trying to change Christ's gospel and preach that you're saved by what you do rather than by what Jesus did. It's not too different really from a parent who's brought up a child and then has to watch while that child makes poor decisions. And when things that you set in motion no longer go according to plan, even though you're no longer in charge of it, you may still well grieve that loss. Paul may write, I'm amazed that you're so quickly deserting God. And other translations say, I'm astonished, or I'm surprised, or I'm shocked. Yet this isn't a pleasant surprise. This isn't the shock of a surprise birthday party. This is a sad, I can't believe you did this. And then having to grieve. Those churches were on one trajectory, and now they're on a different one. Something you created did not go as you had hoped. A minor example would be a cake that didn't rise. I've had cakes come out like about this, and they're supposed to be like this. A life-changing example would be a grown child choosing a path that leads away from God. And there's grief. There's grief that things did not turn out how you had hoped. The churches Paul planted in Galatia are turning toward another gospel, one that is contrary to the gospel of Christ. And while presumably Paul's letter has some effect in bringing folks back around, there's still always grief for those you lose. Finally, in our gospel story today, there is someone on their deathbed, a servant who is very ill and about to die. His master is a Roman centurion or an officer in the Roman army. And this is an officer who is beloved by the Jewish people he oversees. The Jewish elders who go to Jesus say that he loves our people and he even built our synagogue for us. This centurion is obviously a very compassionate, a very caring leader. And so when one of his servants is sick, and so sick that he's not expected to make it, he doesn't say, oh, well, now I got to hire someone else, I got to train someone else, and see people and servants as disposable. No, he sends for Jesus and asks Jesus to heal that servant. Grief often begins before the event even happens. We tend to start feeling sad when we know something sad is coming, even before it's here. This centurion appeared to stay in control of his emotions, yet you can hear he's hurting from what the Jewish elders say about him, that he deserves to have Jesus do this for him. The centurion never directly talks with Jesus. It's all through the messengers. And these messengers beg Jesus to heal the servant on his behalf. The first thing we should do when we're hurting is turn to Jesus. Not to chocolate, not to drink, not to others who will help us throw ourselves a pity party. No, when we are grieving, we turn to Jesus. Because in the midst of loss, even losses that haven't happened yet but are expected, Jesus is the only one who has the words of life. In the Gospel of John, Peter says that to Jesus. He says, "Where else would we go? You alone have the words of eternal life." The centurion's last message to Jesus asks him to simply say the word and my servant will be healed. And Jesus marvels at the centurion's faith. Just say the word, Jesus, and I know it will be okay. I don't know when, I don't know how long, but I know those wonderful words of life, like the hymn says, and I can sing them even from a place of grief, maybe in spite of the loss. Sometimes a word of life is defiant, or maybe it's subversive. Sometimes it's hope in the face of despair. It's resurrection, knowing that there is more to life than what I'm feeling right now. I may be overwhelmed, I may be sad, I may be angry, I may be impatient, yet I still claim those fruits of the Spirit of love, joy, peace, happiness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, kindness, and generosity. And there is no law against such things. That's what Paul writes a little bit later on in this same letter to the Galatians. And Paul ends that chapter by saying, if we live by the Spirit, let's follow the Spirit. Let's not become arrogant or make each other angry or be jealous of each other. Let us not sin in our grief, but turn our eyes instead to Jesus, who can handle everything we throw at him. Promise, everything, even grief. And Jesus, who in the face of grief holds out the hope of resurrection. He's the only one who can hold out that hope of resurrection. Thanks be to God. Amen.